Raised on D&D podcast helps enrich your family's gaming experience by bringing you interviews with parents, educators, game designers, and influencers. Join us as we delve into the many ways that tabletop role-playing games inspire creativity, develop communication skills, and create lasting bonds among players. Your host has been an avid gamer since childhood, and now his kids are being raised on D&D. Here's your host, Nick Cardarelli.
Welcome back, gamers. I'm your host, Nick Cardarelli, and this is Raised on D&D. My next guest is from Rolla, Missouri. He writes an inspirational blog for dungeon masters at SojournersAwake.com. Also a writer for articles at roleplayingtips.com newsletter and produces the Sojourners Awake storytelling podcast. He's working on a course for game masters who want to homebrew their very own adventures. Please welcome Jonathan Hardin. Hi, John.
Thank you for making me feel welcome.
Well, thanks for being on the show. We are so excited about all the content that you're putting out there on your website and Twitter and Instagram. It's just amazing stuff. And thank you so much. But before we jump into all of that, we want you to take us back to your first experience with tabletop role-playing games, where your love for gaming really began.
It's relatively recent. I want to say 2018. Well, I quit my job and I started homeschooling the kids. My wife went to work and I wanted to play a game with them. So we purchased the game Red Dragon Inn. And while I wouldn't completely condone this game for anyone under the age of 21, but we made it a very family-friendly game and we played the game. It was a fun board game, but I couldn't help but teach the kids, oh, wouldn't it be cool if there was a story behind this? And loving that game, I started doing a little searching and I found this thing called Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition and was surprised that you could tell stories with this game. It completely blew away what I thought the game was about. And so I purchased the player's handbook, the box starter set, and took my kids painstakingly through their very first adventure. And we haven't looked back since. So here we are.
Now, that's phenomenal. Now, for a lot of the folks who aren't familiar with it, the Red Dragon Inn is it's a board game, but it's about a fantasy tavern where you are really in a brawl, right? Is that what the board game's about?
Yeah, now I realize the creators designed, what happens to the characters after they plunder the dungeon. Mm-hmm. They come back to the tavern and they get into inter-party conflicts, friendly banter, and then they use their spells against each other or their barbarian rage against each other, and the whole competition game is to win, to win the brawl, and then that's it. And then, the last person standing wins.
So now you started homeschooling in 2018. How old were your children at the time?
Let's see. Well, I'll tell you, my kids are 12, 10, and 8 right now.
Okay.
So math. 18. Well, see. 1822, that's what, 4 years ago.
Yeah.
4 years ago.
So 4 years ago. And when you picked up the Dungeons and Dragons starter box, you were looking for a game that could tell a story, but also the game is cooperative. It's not competitive like the board game. How was that different for you and the kids when you first experienced that?
That is a good question. I, growing up and even as an adult, I never really liked competitive games. And I think the turns and the competition and the conniving that has to take place during certain board games never really was my cup of tea. So when I read through the starter kit, I realized, oh no, there's an arc going through this game. There's a story that can be told. In fact, I could just read the story there. The way I posited it to the kids is that you are going to star as the actors of this book, and you're going to get to influence the outcome. And immediately they understood they had total autonomy. They could direct the story as players. The only limitation was my ability to respond to their actions. And that was initially the clunkiness of being a dungeon master. And my kids will talk about now how they've literally said, Dad, you've really grown as a dungeon master. You're so much better right now than when you were, talking to us through Gundren Rockseeker,
There is no more honest of a critic than a young child. I can tell you that.
Yeah. They're beautifully, they don't hold back.
So Jonathan, I'm curious, you didn't play Dungeons and Dragons or tabletop role-playing games growing up.
No.
Okay. When you said this board game is a lot of fun, the Red Dragon Inn, but I want something with a story, what was it that gravitated you towards Dungeons and Dragons?
As a kid, I remember the first time I was taken through a story was reading The Hobbit. And I had I remember being like 3 years old, having this little audio recording where it chimed and the chime indicated you could turn the page. Yeah. Yep. And I remember thinking like, there's something now I can look back and realize that as a kid, when I was turning the page, I was directing the story. Now, there was only one outcome. Of course, you could only turn the page forward, but there was something about having that participation, the kinetic participation in the story. And I've always enjoyed that, whether it's, gathering my siblings together, playing a game in our backyard growing up, or, in my job as a nurse, part of my job is to listen to people's stories, where did you come from? How did you get here? So I've always had this knack for listening and then asking myself, how can I participate in influencing this story and becoming a part of your story together? So it's not just history, it's our story. Mm-hmm. So when playing Dungeons and Dragons, I think that was the big lead. That's what led me to play the game and enjoy it, is really, it's just about, there's the story and we need to fill in the blanks together. And I'm constantly just between impressed, intrigued, or baffled by the players' decisions, no matter who they are. And I think that's the draw to the game.
So out of necessity, you take on the role of the dungeon master. And as your children have expressed, you've grown quite a bit in your dungeon mastering abilities. So where does the blog and the writing the Dungeon Master tips, when does that come into play?
The blog with Sojourners Awake started as a way for me to journal my thoughts about the philosophy of being a dungeon master. And of course, for me, it's not just about a game. I mean, this is a tool for personal growth. This is a tool for creating self-awareness, reflection, and leveling up in life. And I communicate that to my kids as well, that, I mean, we use a lot of metaphors about developing, your statistics as a human being. There are stats that you've been assigned that you can level up if you apply skill towards that. So I think the blog was more about me marrying my philosophy with life, how to do life better, with some reflections that I've seen while being a dungeon master.
And so you really start this blog for yourself, but then you're putting it out on the internet, you're sharing it with the gaming community, and it develops into even more. So tell us a little bit more about that. How do you grow from the personal blog and the reflections to writing tips for game masters and creating a podcast?
I think there are a lot of blogs out there about how to mechanically run the game better, right? What spells to use, how to develop a stat block. And I never wanted to write that because I don't think that's my strong suit. I think a lot of it is me helping dungeon masters manage the table, because you're dealing with people. And a lot of times, I think a lot of it is just being a dungeon manager or a game manager. There's a lot of people skills that I think, you may or may not have, depending on who you are, what life has afforded you. And a lot of times you find yourself sitting in the dungeon master seat in a role of authority, in a role of making difficult decisions. And sometimes that's about reading the table's energy. What does the table need? Where's the story going? rather than it being just a slog of hitting a bag of hit points, and progressing on. That being said, that's probably a lot of people's favored way to play, and that's totally fine. You've had a hard day at work, you come back, you kick some monsters around, you laugh about the dice, and you move on. If you're looking for something that will help you translate storytelling to your real life, then I think that's where Sojourners Awake comes in. And that's hopefully what you find while reading through the blogs is like, I could use this in my life. I could use these storytelling techniques, number one, to listen to people and understand their perspective, where they're coming from. And then one of my favorite lines in the podcast that I use, what are you paying attention to? Mm-hmm. When you wake up in the morning, when you go to work, when you go to church, when you engage in the world around you, where are you finding that your attention is going? Because that tells more about you and what kind of character you are in the world. Now, if you like that character, how can you develop it? But if you don't like the trajectory that your character is going, and maybe you want to switch, you want to multi-class into a different path in life, how do you do that? I think a lot of the skills we learn from our characters, we can apply to our very own life as people playing in this world. So I think
absolutely.
It's very philosophical, but I think that's, I've always wanted to be the sage, right? I've always wanted to be, find me on the mountaintop. Let's talk about the nitty gritty of life. And I think that's what I try to do with the blog.
I've shared this before, but it's very relevant to what we're talking about. I had to take kind of like an aptitude test, right, for my most recent career. And I sat down in this room. I'm all alone. I know there's cameras on me or something because they leave me by myself and say, hey, take this test. And I'm like, okay, somebody has to be watching, I hope. And I open up the test, though, and the questions are kind of choose your own adventure. They give you a scenario and then all these options on how to resolve it. And I'm like, oh, okay. And then I flip the page and there's a map and it's asking me, to navigate the map. And I'm like, am I being pranked? I'm like, this is a module. And then it gives me this profile of an individual that I have to memorize the physical description and history and things like that. And I'm like, this is a character sheet. I'm looking at a character sheet. So I go through the whole test and I pass with a score that's unprecedented. In fact, I was asked by the person administering the test, had I taken the test prior to this particular engagement? And I said no. And I couldn't say in that moment, but I can tell you all now, it's because of playing Dungeons & Dragons for 30 years. I was able to master that entire booklet test. And I think what a lot of people don't realize is and it surprised me in that moment that I was prepared for this career change because of my hobby. But as parents who are gamers, as we game with our children and we're doing the hacking and slashing and the dungeon crawling, but when we're doing the story and we're doing those interactions, it's growing them in such a way that they have this safe, almost consequence-free fantasy environment where they're able to practice those interactions. When I spoke with my oldest about this, she told me that being able to go into a store and talk to a clerk or a merchant or an owner, whether it was for a job interview or just for asking for help to find something, she said she fell back on those encounters with NPCs in Dungeons and Dragons and was able to say, okay, in this scenario, how can I approach these people? And she said it was almost subconscious. Wasn't even like, she wasn't like, oh, let me take this as a D&D scenario. She just did it. And afterwards reflecting and saying, wow, my training at the table enabled me to be more successful in that scenario in real life than I would have been without it. And I think that with your blog really highlighting that and helping people reflect on that and say, how can I apply that right now today to my life and how can I level up is incredible. It's just amazing.
I think a big one, I say this often because there's a couple of talks out there about can you have D&D without combat? And I have always taken the approach, you cannot have D&D without conflict.
Yes.
Because that's where stories, I would say that's my short answer on that. But what I realized, developing tools and resources and competency around managing conflict, there is not a lot of skill elsewhere. But in D&D, you're right. There's this consequence-free environment in that you don't lose any skin. You don't lose any sleep over this conflict in the game. And a lot of times it's very crystallized and clear what is the conflict. At least I think, between the DM and the players, you can clearly define, yes, you want to get through this dungeon, but there is a monster that wants something else. And so now you must reconcile those two opposing views or those two opposing desires. And, a lot of times it does get whittled down to, I draw my sword, roll initiative, let's fight it out, which is great too, because that is a way to settle the conflict. Like, okay, let's remove the obstacle. Because sometimes within life, the conflict is not a friend or a family member or a fellow human that we should be showing love to. It's a thought within yourself. I'm not good enough to try out for the team. That's a monster. And you can take a sword to that and defeat that enemy within, so to speak. So that's the exciting part about playing D&D with kids is, you have fun. And while you're having fun, you're accidentally learning solid life skills for managing conflict.
That's incredible. And, and the other thing is that you're equipping them. You're equipping them when you're playing. You're letting them know this is how not only can you resolve, like you said, with outside conflict, but also with internal conflict. And I think when we personify, not to get too heady here, but I think when we personify those things that hold us back in life or handicap us that are internal, if we personify those things as an external conflict and being imposed upon us, it's much easier to be motivated to defeat it than to say that's part of my personality and I can't change, right? So I think that is an incredible gift to give our young people so that as they grow up, they're not kind of weighed down by these things that we're, as adults, we're trying to work through like a complicated puzzle where they're not even saddled with it because they've worked through it at the game table growing up on how to resolve that. That's fantastic. The other thing I want to go back to is you mentioned that dungeon mastering is more like dungeon management, right? And so when you're looking at the table, one of the benefits for me as a dungeon master when I have people at the table is I'm able to read the table a little bit better. I can kind of see the players' energy levels going up and down, and I can see their attention fading and focusing, right? And so as I'm doing that, I can adjust the tempo of the adventure. Hey, do we need a sudden landslide in this moment? Do I need a sudden unexpected ambush in this moment to kind of get the pace back up and get the excitement back in? And I think online, I've been running games on Roll20 since 2013, and it is more challenging to do it online than it is at the table for me personally. But when you're talking about that table management and saying, well, okay, one of the things that I think is as parents, we can all agree on is that when you have multiple children, they're not cookie cutter. They're not all the same. They're very individuals. They all have their own personalities, strengths and weaknesses, their own interests and talents. And I think that really helps you grow as a dungeon master when you have these very different personalities at the table. What could you add to that, Jonathan?
I agree. And I think anyone working with children would say that there's a level of authenticity and honesty that is incredibly refreshing. And when adults can be polite and they might sit through a 2-hour game, not really interested. And you kind of wonder, like, man, was I off my game? The energy was kind of low. It was boring, and that's fine. A kid will not let that go 30 seconds before this is boring. Or they'll just slump in their seat. Their body language will just exude boredom. And so I think there's a lot less guesswork with kids. And that's what I found with my kids is that I know my middle daughter, I was reading through one of the 5th edition modules, just going through the box text and going through the adventure. And then, halfway through the line, I realized, this is heavy, a little too heavy for kids. But I thought that, and immediately my daughter said, like, Dad, this is too dark. No, rewind the tape. This is too dark. And I said, yeah, I agree. We're going to take a break and I'm going to kind of reformat this adventure real quick. She didn't let the adventure go on past the point of discomfort. Mm-hmm. And I appreciate that about playing with kids. They've helped me quickly see when the energy shifts. And so a lot of times in my mind, I might think like, yeah, this kind of got boring, or this got too heavy, or this was too easy. A lot of times kids will get bored if the encounters are too easy. Mm-hmm. And there's no challenge. They appreciate the conflict. They appreciate the obstacles. So that finding that balance, I think, is the kids they don't politely just sit and wait for your lecture to finish. No, they interrupt, and that's helped me pick up on like what is pleasant, what is enjoyable, to steer away from boredom and steer away from when the game might get too heavy. And I think that's helped with my adult games, because I've been trained by my kids to keep it popping,
Yep. And another thing that I notice is that with children, if the tempo gets too boring, you'll notice that their characters start doing some zany things to get the game pumping again. And so when you see that and you're like, oh, okay, well, I didn't pick up on the boringness. And instead of telling me, now the characters are doing some crazy stuff. So, and that's another, like you said, an honest cue to let you know where, yeah, adults will know to go, oh, well, maybe it'll get better in 30 minutes.
Something else I've also noticed too, I don't wonder if this is true. I have found that in my adult games, everyone appreciates the strong story structure. This is where the story begins and this is where the story ends. Some people might call that railroading, but I lay out a very clear path of success. Now, along the way, how that success is manifested is, of course, up to the players. But with children, I've noticed they appreciate the quest of explore the world, and I thought, my kids do like Minecraft, and with Minecraft, the quest is to explore and build and enjoy your creations. And I noticed that a lot of times in the games, they may not appreciate like something that's like Tyranny of Dragons, like here's the story that begins and then you have a final showdown with Tiamat at the end. They have played that game and they appreciated it, but they also appreciate being able to go into a jungle. And when I describe a nondescript rock, they're like, that's the thing we want to explore. We're going to exhaust every possible mechanic about this rock. And then that's it. And then we'll move on. And that might take 5 days in game as they tunnel under the rock, they climb on top of the rock, they jump off the rock. It becomes like a playground toy that they just want to wear out. And I see that more in kids games than in adult games.
And I think too that what's an important takeaway here for parents who are running games for kids is to realize the story takes a back seat when the players find something that they're excited about. In other words, don't force the story to go forward. Like you said, it could be 5 days in game of them exploring that rock. And as dungeon masters for younger children, you want to allow them the opportunity to exhaust that exploration, because for them, that's part of the experience that they are enjoying the most and that they're going to remember the most and things like that. Would you agree with that, Jonathan?
Yeah, totally. It's the skill they can flex is to explore a toy or an idea or a place to its fullest. And to really, and that's why I think that's where kids, show us up as adults, is they really do stop and smell the roses, and everything else takes a back seat to that. And they just soak up all the excitement from a particular thing.
And I think so that where it helps you grow as a dungeon master is just flexing some muscles. Like you said, you really don't encounter as much with adults because they have a clear concept of a story arc and understand how it's going to work out, where children are going to go in those different directions. And you as the dungeon master have to be patient, you have to be flexible, and you have to be spontaneous.
I've done a little bit of work around personality typing, and I realized that that's influenced a lot of the games, because I'll have some type A personality players who want clear objectives, clear measurements of success, and there's not a lot of dilly-dally. And then I'll have another adult, though, who they enjoy sitting in a moment. And maybe they enjoy all the interactions with the NPCs. And depending on, and I think that's where being a dungeon manager comes into play. Like, as you know your people, your players, I think you can cater those encounters and those adventures to the actual people at the table. And that's something I try to remember is, don't get table envy. There might be some players over there that, well, you can learn from them, but at the end of the day, the prep work that I'm doing is for my players. And as well as I know them, it doesn't have to be anything major of what life they're going through, but I know my players, and I know, that one always enjoys good banter with an NPC. So I'm careful to include that. There's another player who, if things linger too long, he is always the first one to say, let's move on. And so I want to make sure to have those strong transitions from scene to scene ready for him. And I think that's just, but that's what, maybe that comes from being a dungeon master for kids, is you're having to think about the children at your table, the players at your table, which, I think, let's face it, we're all still 2-year-olds. We've just gotten more sophisticated, but, at the end of the day, we're just kids and we want to play. And that's, that's my secret is I know my players, they're all just kids and we all just want to play, and we get to do it through playing D&D. And it's surprisingly innocent and childlike, and I think awakens a lot of childlike faith within us. And that to me, that's like the end of a good game.
Now, Jonathan, you've got the blog and the podcast going, but now you're working on a course for dungeon masters to kind of empower them to homebrew their own adventures and campaigns. What can you tell us a little bit about that?
So I subscribed to Role Playing Tips newsletter, and then eventually was asked, hey, write some articles for us. And I loved doing that because I found out that, along with the philosophy, I think I have some really good ideas on how to say this plus this equals a great adventure, using that story, the 5 C's of storytelling, or the great formula for storytelling. And I decided, okay, I'm going to make a adventure design course for brand new game masters. Maybe you don't want to buy any published books, or you just want to take your own homebrew world and set up an adventure. Here's 6 lessons that I designed. They're usually about, anywhere from 35 minutes to an hour. If you want to invest in your craft as a dungeon master and have like a solid structure with worksheets available, and you can just fill in the blanks as if you were doing a Mad Lib, like the quest giver. Like that's a good example. Like I show you like, here's how to design a quest giver. Here's why a quest giver works. This is why an adventure falls flat. I talk a lot about how to anchor the player characters into the story that you've designed. So you're merging the hard work you've done homebrewing your setting with the hard work that the players have done with their backstory. And really, when you marry that into some kind of anchor point could be a person. It could be a specific thing. It could be like a place, and depending on what kind of adventure. So I use a lot of literary techniques like, and a person, place, thing that's obviously a noun, so, and then try to teach dungeon masters how to use those transition moments to help their games have a solid flow, so that you feel like, man, we're telling a story here. We're creating our own entertainment. How cool is that?
And that's fantastic, because I can tell you from being a dungeon master over 30 years, there was a lot of trial and error. The books had some advice, but they didn't really to have like a course or like you said, something to fill out like a Mad Lib that kind of teaches you the formula of the story was not something readily available all those years ago. And so you just had a lot of running games where it was hit or miss, and you had to kind of back away and do some self-reflection and even kind of interrogate your friends and say, where did that go awry, so that you could kind of recalibrate for the next session. And I think a resource like your Game Master's course is going to take a lot of the guesswork out for a lot of new dungeon masters, and maybe even for some older dungeon masters, because one of the things that we run into is some people are very fortunate to game with the same 4 or 5 people for 20 years. But what happens more often than not is players come and go. And when you're the forever dungeon master, sometimes it's a different lineup every time you get together to game. And so to be able to take away the guesswork, take away the hit and miss, be able to make solid original adventures for your group, whether you've been gaming together for years or whether you're just starting a new group, is just incredible. It's a fantastic idea, and we're excited to see it come out, and I'm excited to get a hold of it myself. As resources for dungeon masters and game masters started to roll out about the mid 90s, early 2000s, I would start to scoop them up, because like you said, as a dungeon master, you want to work on your craft to make the time spent together the most enjoyable it can be, because we all just want to play and have fun. For the parents at home, I know a lot of folks are already following you on Twitter and Instagram, but for the folks at home that are just kind of diving in, what is your advice for getting the kids to the table and starting, especially for those parents who haven't been gamers for 20, 30 years, and they're jumping into it like you did in 2018?
I think one of the most important pieces to remember is that when you're playing with children, 30 minutes of time spent with your kids is golden. I mean, out of everything, I mean, if D&D were to go away, tabletop role playing were to go away, quality time does not. Do not forget that your kids will remember this, and they will remember that this is an investment that you put into them, saying, I care about you. My mom used to have like this picture over the piano in our home. Children spell love, Time. And it just, don't forget that, so you might get hung up. I don't want anyone to get hung up on like what kind of story we should tell, or what published adventure, or what homebrew adventure. If you show up giving undivided attention to your children, they are going to treasure that.
Absolutely. And they may not remember every detail of adventures like we will, but they will remember the time. Jonathan, thank you so much for all of your contributions to the gaming community with your blog and your podcast, and now this course coming out. Thank you for being on the show.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.